Meet the Lot, native token of Lukki Exchange and the most potential tool for investing this year. Trade now on P2B, B2B and Lukki.io.
Payment system, 5 transactions per second, so nobody's using it for payment system, and it's not scalable, it's impossible. And it's also not a stable source of store of value for payments or wealth, because the value can go up in an hour 20% and collapse in an hour by 20%. So it's the most inefficient, it's the most costly, it's the most scamming, corrupt system, because 81% of all ICOs were scammed to begin with. There is massive price manipulation, much more than under Wall Street. You have 95% of all Bitcoin transaction study suggested are fake, and you have front running, and you have pump and dump, and you have wash trading, and you have all the other things. It's not secure, it's much more insecure than the legacy financial system, because 10% of all Bitcoin has been hacked, and every other day there is an exchange is being hacked. And the ideology is one of decentralization, but there is no decentralization. The miners, the ownership of this stuff, the centralized exchange is all centralized, but it's nice meat for those who believe that you can become rich overnight. It gives a chance to everybody to become rich overnight to create another shitcoin.
And that's what we believe in.
So it was a parody of the legacy system, but much worse than it, and for a while was successful, and you have bigger boom and bubble and bust and crash than you do in the legacy financial system. So that's why I created it. People took it seriously. It was not the intention. It was a parody of the system, but it worked too well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. You heard it here first. So Vitalik, I saw you kind of twitching a little bit at some of those comments. So for me, I'd like to understand the fundamental value of crypto. It's great for buying drugs. Just last night, we were discussing a scheme where you can have drugs delivered to your house by drone and paid for, of course, by cryptocurrencies. This is truly the fourth industrial revolution, and some say it's the start of the singularity. So aside from buying drugs, Vitalik, can you summarize the value of cryptocurrencies and why that's important?
Sure. So I guess starting from censorship resistance, because that's the kind of first thing that people mention and people love to mention. It's really important, and I think people don't realize that quote drugs and kind of in the US, for example, there's been this kind of growing epidemic of corporate censorship, and often corporate censorship with kind of shadowy involvement from government actors in some cases. So there was something called Operation Choke Point in 2014, where the So there are instances of things like this happening, and especially as there's been this kind of concern of sectors of the economy becoming more monopolized, there is a lot of power that we're putting in by corporate actors, and they are going to be trying to insert their ideology into things and censor things. So I think there's that entire whole aspect of censorship resistance that I think should not be forgotten. But even aside from that, I personally have used cryptocurrencies to make payments, for example, just make payments to Ethereum foundation contractors all over the world. I personally, Andreas mentioned that at some point we're going to hit parity. For this particular, wait 3 to 5 days for a wire transfer, just ask them for an ETH address, they give you an ETH address, you send the money, and you can pay a contractor in 30 seconds. And I've done it, and at least personally for me, it's been great. Also, for international payments in general, traditional legacy financial systems, there are a lot of real inefficiencies there, and I think there's reasons to expect many of those inefficiencies to continue. And cryptocurrency just practically does have genuine conveniences to it. Now, I do think it's the case that a lot of those conveniences are kind of stronger for people who just engage in activities that are more kind of unconventional. So definitely kind of not the experience of a lot of kind of more mainstream people, which is why I think there's this kind of disconnect where some people see why it's really valuable, other people just think, what the hell, it's completely useless. But I do think that over time, as it became easier for people in the world to kind of have access to different kinds of even traditional assets, and then at some point we can start moving to a non-financial applications, kind of blockchain applications other than cryptocurrency, which is this other big story that I think has been happening and is going to start happening soon.
Perfect, thank you. Did you want to touch on one of Vitalik's comments?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a myth that Bitcoin and crypto was cracked and so on, because, you know, while it's much more easy actually to find who's behind a certain wallet than a shady banking system where transaction occurs through tons of layers. That's why I don't think actual crypto applications in payments for criminal activities is going to be the future of it. A lot of it is cracking down. And the reality is that since it's not anonymous, and yeah, there are some cryptocurrencies that claim they're going to be fully anonymous like Monero, but even Steve Mnuchin, who is the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and he's not a communist, he said we cannot allow crypto to become the next Swiss bank account, and therefore there is a KYC, there's AML. In exchanges, everybody's going to have to declare their assets so that you can monitor, you can have a tax audit and so on. The reality is that this space is not going to be anonymous, and even in countries like Argentina or Venezuela, if you have a kleptocratic government that wants to take over your wealth, you're going to make sure that all that stuff is registered, and if they want to tax you or expropriate your crypto wealth, they're going to do it as well as in the legacy financial system. So I think there's this myth about censorship resistance, but in reality, no G20 government, no other government around the world is going to allow full anonymity. You'll have to register stuff, and there are good reasons. There are tax evaders, there are criminals, there are human traffickers, there is so on, and therefore all of this space is going to be monitored. So this hope that everything is anonymous actually is not true, and is not censorship resistant. And even in countries that are these expropriating kleptocratic dictators, they're going to go after your crypto wealth the same way they go after your bank wealth. It's a myth you're going to be able to protect yourself. It's not going to happen.
So you're both part of migratory families. Vitalik, you're Russian, Canada, Rabini, you lived in Iran, Turkey, and Israel when you were younger. So both of you, can you agree that wouldn't a store of value, even if it did go up and down a little bit in value, wouldn't you value something which you could take with you, something that was undetectable, unconfiscatable, and you could remove it from oppressive regimes without fear of it being confiscated?
Yeah, and I definitely think there's value to something like that existing. And I'm not definitely not the sort of person that wants kind of crypto, like all activity in the world to kind of be running on crypto, but I think there's definitely an important niche for things like that to exist.
And in terms of the anonymity thing, so what we saw the first generation blockchains, where you're right, people had addresses, kind of pseudonyms, and you could see money moving from one account to another. But then we've had the next generations, we've got zero knowledge proofs and things like that. The Wimble protocol, so new cryptocurrencies, which make it a lot harder to detect where the money's moving, to obfuscate the transactions. There's some sort of cold war between the cryptographers and law enforcement. Vitalik, can you comment on what's going on?
Yeah, I've looked at and written blog posts about the technology behind Zcash, Zk Snarks myself, and it's like legitimately really cool. And I mean, like, I definitely have a strong intuition that its privacy is like very powerful, and I think like if it breaks, it's more likely to break in the soundness direction. So like breaking by by people being able to make fake proofs. I think the privacy does have a quite low probability of breaking. I think there definitely is this kind of technological kind of cold war between people trying to evade systems of control and people trying to create them, but that's also a story that's like way bigger than just the internet and cryptography and cryptocurrency. You have things. You have the internet, then you have like national restrictions on websites popping up, then you have VPNs to get around those. There's the whole story around file sharing, and then offline there's this kind of trend which I think really unfortunately is going purely in the direction of decreasing privacy, which is surveillance cameras popping up everywhere, to the point where like offline kind of resisting authority is just going to continue becoming more and more difficult. And so like David Friedman, like this Milton's son, this wonderful character, wrote this book called Future Imperfect, and one of the predictions he made is that kind of privacy offline is just going to get harder and harder, but privacy online that's the kind of different kind of battlefield where just because the kind of rules of the game are different, privacy is actually possibly going to get easier over time. And so that could just be the thing that society needs as a compromise.
And this is a society that you want to see, Nouriel?
Well, I think there are good reasons why governments from G20 to emerging markets want to avoid a variety of activities that are socially nefarious. There's already a huge amount of international capital mobilities, and every year government loses hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue because they cannot tax capital. They end up taxing people like myself, labor, rather than capital. So there are good reasons why we have AML and FIC. We want to avoid tax avoidance and tax evasion. There is a lot of criminality, there is terrorism, there is human trafficking, there is lots of shady activity occur, trillions of dollars across the world. That's why no country in the world can allow a system in which every financial transaction is anonymous. And that's why they're going to crack down on the anonymity of cryptocurrencies. And as I said, Bitcoin is not anonymous. There are now attempts of making fully anonymous cryptocurrencies. That's not going to pass. There is no legitimate government in the world, not among advanced economies, not among emerging markets, who can allow crypto to become the next Swiss bank account, not even in the United States. And that's not going to be allowed, and there are lots of good social reasons why we want to crack down on those criminal or socially not reputable activities. That's the logic of having sovereign states. Now, if you believe in an anarchic system, you can believe in your decentralized, anarcho-capitalist or libertarian system, is not going to fly. There's no legitimate government going to accept that, and they're going to crack down on it, whether you like it or not. There are good reasons why they're going to crack down on it, really.
And I think,
otherwise, we're going back to a system of total anarchy.
And I think it's there's definitely a bit of a misconception, I would say, among both proponents and opponents of kind of the privacy and more crypto-anarchic side of crypto, which is that, like, even if we assume that total privacy of crypto financial transactions becomes possible, that will lead to this kind of crypto-anarchic, like, utopia or dystopia, depending on what your leanings are. I think, like, in practice, right, and people get caught for tax evasion, like, very often not because their bank accounts get searched. They get caught because they report $20,000 of income on their tax returns, but they have 5 mansions and a private jet. They get caught because corporations still ultimately get audited every year. They get caught because if their economic interactions have counterparties and their counterparties can rat them out, and if these transactions happen on blockchains, those counterparties can potentially be subpoenaed and be required to provide cryptographic proofs that some transaction happened. I also even think that there's opportunities with the kind of powers of cryptography to improve things like privacy-preserving tax compliance, for example. So, like, one kind of setup that you might imagine happening is if, like, let's say, for example, you have a store in the real world, and the store is selling cookies, and they need to pay 10% sales tax. I mean, first of all, you can audit it because you can just have auditors go to the store, buy cookies, and they can check, like, whether or not for that particular transaction there was a corresponding entry that paid the sales tax to the government. So you can check those things, but at the same time, you can use your knowledge proofs to do so in such a way that no kind of agency other than those two parties needs to know the details of the specific transaction. So, like, cryptography is just this really powerful kind of math in a way that I think a lot of people don't appreciate, that actually allows these kind of really clever kinds of compromises where the people that needs to know, like, specific claims, so in this case, like, that this 10% sales tax is being paid, can know that fact, but without this, like, massively breaking everyone's privacy completely, which is something that I do worry is going to happen if we end up kind of moving en masse to these centralized online, like, payment platforms, and everything is happening through, like, Apple Pay and WeChat Pay and Facebook Pay, and we just have these information gathering choke points.
Cool, thank you. And we already have this in PTK already. So
tax coin, PTK.
PTK tax coin. So I want to move away from anonymity and talk about centralization. So Nouriel, in the Lubin debate, which I was watching last night, you mentioned that cryptocurrencies are centralized. The mining, the exchanges, the developers. And regarding Vitalik, you used the phrase benevolent dictator, which is awesome. Who has power to undo the blockchain, for example, in the case of the DAO hack. And it sounds like romance is in the air. Do you want to discuss this face to face?
Well, I think one of the most important contributions Vitalik has made to this space is his famous trilemma that says you cannot have at the same time scalability, decentralization, and security. And what has happened actually is that while there is this myth of decentralization, first of all, as we know, currently any type of transactions on crypto is not much scalable. You can do 5 transactions with Bitcoin, maybe 7 to 10 with Ethereum. These can do per second, so it's not scalable. And the reality is the only solution, in my view, that will lead to scalability are going to imply some significant degree of centralization, because if it's fully decentralized, by definition, you can't have hundreds of thousands of computers, including mine, including every transaction that is there on the blockchain, so it's not scalable definition. But the reality is that this system that was supposed to be decentralization is totally centralized. There is massive centralization among the miners. It's becoming an oligopoly because there are economies of scale into mining. And that leads actually to severe problems of various sorts, 51% attacks, or having fees that are much more than under competitive equilibrium when you have an oligopoly. You have massive centralization of exchanges. These DEXs, nobody's using them. 99% of all transactions occur on centralized exchanges, and every other day one of them is being hacked, and when it's hacked, your money is gone forever. You have centralization of wealth. I've argued based on one study that that inequality in Bitcoin is worse than North Korea. I don't care whether it's slightly better or slightly worse. It's significant, that inequality. And there's also centralization among the developers. I mean, it's not me. People in the field have said that Vitalik is the benevolent dictator for life, and when shit happens, like it happens every other day, then you fork it and you create another one, and code is not law, and smart contracts are neither smart nor they are real contracts. So we talk about decentralization, and there is no decentralization. It's becoming massively centralized, more centralized than legacy financial system. It's a joke, it's a myth.
Okay, there's so much you can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, first of all, just one point on statistics, and I actually looked up the numbers about this North Korea thing a while back, and basically the idea is that North Korea's income Gini coefficient is 0.88. Bitcoin's Bitcoin's wealth Gini coefficient, so the distribution of holdings was 0.88. But income Gini coefficients are always much lower than wealth Gini coefficients. So for example, in the United States, the income Gini is about 0.42, the wealth Gini is 0.8, and in North Korea, the wealth Gini is about 0.95. But then also, these numbers are all kind of meaningless because they reflect addresses and not people. People have many addresses, and I probably have somewhere between 10 and 20 Ethereum addresses. Most of them have little small coins. So even within the set of addresses controlled by me, the Gini is somewhere around 0.95. So I think...
Can you share the private keys of those addresses?
0x1f2c. No, that would be privacy. Yeah, so these things are hard to measure. I definitely think there is, and wealth inequality is a big challenge in this space, but there is a lot. It's also definitely kind of not as bad as some of the more extreme critics claim. On the decentralization side, I think, there's definitely some of the genuine concerns that Nouriel brought up, but I think a lot of them are an artifact of the technology as it exists in 2018 or in 2019. Rather than something that's kind of inherent to the technology. So when I came up with the trilemma, notably the trilemma did not come with a mathematical proof, right? And the trilemma is even explicitly said, not that it's impossible to have scalability, security, and decentralization at the same time, but that it's very hard. And now there is this kind of whole set of solutions that people are coming up with and actively working on. Sharding is one of them, and sharding is something that I would even claim actually potentially increases decentralization, because it creates this property that instead of everyone having the same fixed cost of verifying transactions, like as a proof of stake validator, you would have to verify fewer transactions. If you have less ETH, verify more transactions. If you have more ETH, and so that actually turns one of the fixed costs into a variable cost. And sharding could potentially increase the scalability of the system to somewhere in the low tens of thousands of transactions per second. There's Plasma, which has test networks. There's state channel systems, which are starting to go live on mainnet. So these things do exist. These things are being actively developed. And I do think that what Andreas called kind of parity with a traditional finance in terms of usability is something that is going to be reached in the next couple of years. And when that happens, I think it's genuinely going to be a very different game. Like even from about decentralized exchanges, that's a game that's recently changed already. Like Uniswap launched about a couple of months ago, and it's basically an exchange between Ether and ERC20 tokens that's extremely convenient to use. You just go to a website, enter your address and click. And it's, I would say, way easier to use than centralized exchanges because you don't have to set up an account.
No KYC, you don't have to bother with any of that.
Yeah, and it's just click a button and you've turned a token into another token, and now it's the third largest application on Ethereum in terms of money stored inside of it. So I think the tech genuinely is improving, and I think we can expect the tech to seriously continue improving over the next 5 years.
So basically your arguments are kind of... So your arguments exist today, but you're saying in the future things are going to get better.
I disagree. I mean, we all agree that proof of work is not scalable, and even within proof of work, there is massive centralization of mining. If and when, and you talked about proof of stake, in 2013 is not out yet. People tell me it's going to take maybe another 2 years until you try it, until it fails. Proof of stake is going to be more centralized, actually, than proof of work, because the more you have stake, the more you have power. So that problem is going to become even worse, and if it's centralized, it's not secure. And now people talk about the stuff, Casper, sharding, and so on, even more esoteric. The reality is that you cannot have a system that is scalable, is decentralized, because I cannot track on my computer and millions of small computers every transaction. So by definition, if it's scalable, it has to be a system where there is a significant amount of concentration of mining and verification of transactions. And once that happens, there is no security. And that problem has not been resolved. And that's the trilemma you talked about. People say there'll be a solution. We have not seen even proof of stake, let alone stuff that is more advanced. I just don't believe it.
So first of all, regarding proof of stake not having still being far away and not being launched yet, I want to give a shout out to Cosmos, which has a live network running proof of stake as of about a week ago. And Ethereum 2.0 has testnets, and it's going to launch fairly soon. Regarding this kind of trilemma, the issue is that there's definitely this assumption that a lot of people make that for a system to be decentralized, you have to verify every transaction personally. But the way that all of these solutions to the trilemma work is that they basically rely on different kinds of loopholes to verify things indirectly, so you can verify many transactions without actually running through the computation yourself, right? So for example, if you want to verify validity, then you have a scalable zero-knowledge proofs, where one person runs the computation and makes a proof of validity, and then that's a proof that that anyone can check in a very short amount of time. If you want to verify data availability, then you have these techniques like random sampling and erasure coding. If you want to verify validity without using ZK snarks or ZK starks, then you can do it with fraud proofs. So there are all of these techniques that people are developing, and the science is advancing, and I expect it will continue advancing.
So it is real. The technology is improving.
I'll believe it when I see it. Something that is truly scalable, truly decentralized, and truly secure. And there's no security in crypto today. Really, the amount of insecurity is massive. Then we'll see. For now, it's been talk and vaporware. Let's wait and see.
Testnets.
And testnets. This is awesome. You're using his trilemma kind of to provide the other side of the argument. Okay, let's move to monetary inflation in cryptocurrencies. At PTK, we fundamentally believe in getting rich quick. So every few weeks, So every few weeks we do a hard fork, like we copied Vitalik with Ethereum Classic, because it doubles our money, which is awesome. But unfortunately, it doesn't work with my bank account. We can't fork our bank account. So Vitalik, if everyone's making all their new currencies and they're adding new layers of technology and it's all starting to get a bit confusing, how on earth can this asset class as a whole stabilize?
Yeah, so I actually wrote this post on ETH Research about this about a year ago, where I made this kind of semi-formal economic model. And that basically shows that even if it's possible to issue new cryptocurrencies, that does not immediately lead to like hyperinflation of the existing ones, and doesn't even necessarily ever need to lead to hyperinflation of the existing ones, which is unsurprising because it's been the actual experience status quo in the real world. And the basic model is that even though anyone can technically print a cryptocurrency on a piece of toilet paper, the thing that's much harder is to print a cryptocurrency that people care about. And getting into this kind of set of cryptocurrencies that people care about and are willing to assign value to is something that actually takes a very significant amount of effort, and I would argue a growing amount of effort with every passing year. And so I do expect that in the long term, like some of the most of the shit coins that currently have like $1 to $10 million market caps will probably just keep on decreasing and will go nowhere. But so the kind of bar that you need to pass to have a crypto asset that maintains its value is going to continue increasing. But as we've seen now, and as I think is theoretically, at least the economics shows theoretically possible, we can definitely have multiple cryptocurrencies going on into the future, all maintaining a non-zero value. And that becomes even easier once we start taking into account the possibility of tokens being actively burned for transaction fees, for example.
And which cryptocurrencies do you care about now?
Huh? Which one?
Which of the cryptocurrencies?
BTK, the biggest.
Big fan of
The biggest shitcoin of all. So if I could answer on Vitalik, there's this argument that central bankers debase their fiat currencies, the value of the dollar lost 95% of its value since 1913 when it was created, and that quantitative easing is another way of debasing stuff. The reality is actually it took not 100 years like the dollar, it took literally 1 year, 2018, for the average crypto coin to lose 95% of its value. And why that has happened? People worry about the central bank creating money through QE, 4x compared to 10 years ago. The creation of money in crypto has been not 4x, 1000x. Every other day there was another shitcoin being created. You don't even know what are the rules for creating this money supply at will. One after the other, we created a massive bubble, and now there's collapse. Bitcoin lost what, 85% of its value last year. The other top 10, including Ethereum, lost 90% plus, and the average shitcoin lost 95 to 99% of its value. So what has taken 100 years for the Fed to do, they've done it in 1 year.
Exactly.
In 1 year. And in 99, it's much more efficient way of debasing currency, in printing money at will, 1000K X rather than 4X. And so on. And the reality is in 99% of countries in the world today, the problem is not of having too much inflation. ECB, the Fed, the BOJ cannot even achieve 2%. Most emerging markets achieve their 2% inflation target. Venezuela and Zimbabwe are really the exception. 2-3 countries out of 200 plus that have this problem. And the reality is that we have a problem of low inflation, nobody's debasing anything, and crypto is not an alternative. That's why nobody's using it. The debasement has occurred in crypto, not in fiat currencies.
So, and I actually agree that a lot of the arguments about fiat currencies going to zero are kind of completely overblown. So, I think the kind of usual counter-argument is that people say the value of a US dollar denominated in consumer price indices has gone down by 96% over the last 100 years, but you're not intended to hold US dollars. And if you instead do the math with, instead of using US dollars, using even treasury inflation protected securities, then your money goes up by, I think, a factor of somewhere between 1.5 and 3. I forget the details. So I don't think like avoiding inflation in the United States is the reason why people are interested in cryptocurrencies. I think, one part of it is just kind of political diversification, which I think is something that is going to continue to be relevant, especially as kind of in the mainstream, there's been all of this discourse kind of around, the fracturing of the liberal world order and so forth. I think like political risk is something that is going to continue to be a part of people's lives, and is something that people are going to continue wanting to protect themselves against. Regarding just cryptocurrencies dropping in value much more quickly, like I agree that happened. Though as of 2 days ago, the statistics are that Bitcoin dropped by 75% and Ether by 87%. But the thing is, like, first of all, these are early stage assets, and like over time, we can definitely expect the volatility to kind of decrease somewhat, but then also not too much, right? Because things like gold in the stock market are also continue to be pretty volatile, for example. So, I definitely do not advocate, for example, like Bitcoin and Ether, becoming the world's unit of account, because like I've read the economic arguments, and like there's a lot of legitimacy to this idea that if you have a volatile unit of account, then it just becomes harder for people to make long-term plans, and people would have to just keep on adjusting prices more frequently, and that could lead to much less economic growth and kind of
Let's stop agreeing with each other. I'm trying to.
I think no, like the value, there are ways to have cryptocurrencies that are more price stable, like MakerDAO, for example, being like one example. I just think the value of cryptocurrencies in the short term it's definitely not a kind of drop in replace take over the world thing. It is a more niche tool, but it's something that is still valuable as a medium of exchange, as a way of making international payments. The blockchain itself as a way of making these different kinds of smart contract applications, even all of these non-financial use cases of the blockchain. So I personally see the value more in that than in replacing fiat currencies.
So why don't we explore that a little bit? So I heard a rumor on Twitter, which is where I get my news from, that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is adding Bitcoin, Ethereum Classic, Pitch Token, PTK, and Tron, but not BCH, to their SDR basket, their special drawing rights, which is a basket of the most used currencies in the world. If this rumor were true, what impact would it have? And would any central bank ever hold bags of cryptocurrencies?
Well, of course, that's a joke. And no central bank is thinking about holding cryptocurrencies as a reserve asset. What central banks are talking about, and there's a discussion in central banking community whether to have a central bank digital currency. And as soon as there are these news about it, the people in crypto get excited and see it's becoming mainstream. Even central bank want to replace cash with a central bank digital currency. But if you look carefully what they want to do, if and when they're going to do it, it's not going to be on the blockchain, it's not going to be crypto. Today, the financial system is such that only banks have access to the balance sheet of the Fed, for example, in the US. So if you're a private individual or corporation, you have to use the banking system and deposit to make those transactions, either checks or wire or you name it. Suppose you have the central bank digital currency, every individual, every corporation, not just bank, will have access to the central bank balance sheet, and therefore transactions become instantaneous, they're free, they're costless, they're efficient, and that replaces not only completely cryptocurrencies that are not a means of payment today, but also replaces bank deposits as an alternative, and that replaces also some of these digital kind of payment system, the Venmo, PayPal, Alipay of the world. So if and when they're going to decide to do so, it's not going to be on the blockchain, it's going to be on a single ledger, it's going to be secure, it's going to be with no transaction, and it's going to displace everything else. But it's not a blockchain or it's not a cryptocurrency. It's something very, very different. It has many important implications for the financial stability of the economy and so on, but it's not crypto. That's what central banks are talking about.
No central banks would hold crypto. Vitalik?
And I actually think the concept of central bank digital currency is like really cool, and I think there's definitely a lot of positive impacts that can come out of disintermediating banks. And aside, along with that, though, the one that I'm possibly worried about is that with a kind of CBDC designed naively, you basically have the government having access to everyone's transaction data by default. Whereas in the current system, the intermediation, like even though it creates kind of points of rent seeking, it also creates a kind of points of friction for data collection. And we're moving toward the world where some single opaque kind of institutionally control mechanism has access to hundreds of millions of people's financial transactions, and is something that's potentially a pretty scary thing. And even if cryptocurrency ends up going nowhere, one positive social impact I think it could have is that if people get used to the idea that they expect their money to have privacy, then I think that could put a lot of kind of socially positive pressure on CBDC developers around the world to take those concerns in mind and make sure their systems do preserve people's privacy to an extent that people find reasonable and acceptable. Regarding cryptocurrency and central banks holding it, I'm not so pessimistic. I think, like, first of all, they do already hold gold, and I think, like, if you look at the younger generations, like, a lot of people just find gold lame and uninteresting, and they find like digital coins new and exciting, and it just, meme power helps to elect the president. So why can't just
Central banks will hold crypto.
That is private unless, like the current system, if a tax authority needs to do an audit of you, they can look even into your bank account and see your transaction. So you can have an anonymous central bank digital currency, and if a tax authority has to do an audit, then those transactions become something that are auditable. So you can have the same system exist today with the central bank. You don't have to give up anonymity and privacy in that system. But as I said, I think even a central bank digital currency is not going to happen anytime soon, let alone having central banks holding, crypto assets. I think that's far-fetched, personally.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. The time is up, and guys, you've been phenomenal. I've learned so much. You both agree and disagree on different things, so it's been a great panel. I wanted to present you with some gifts for being good sports. So here's a book that I wrote called The Basics of Bitcoins and Blockchains, which is available on Amazon.com and all good bookstores. So I think you guys need this because it will help. So dear Nouriel, you can be my student anytime.
Okay.
And Vitalik, I think you're going to need this in your journey towards F2.0. Okay guys, so audience, give a round of applause for our panelists, Nouriel and Vitalik. Thank you very much.